Welcome to another session on the Cloud Security Alliance's Cloud Controls Matrix, the CCM. This section focuses on supply chain management, transparency, and accountability domain within the CCM, a critical area for ensuring trust and security in cloud supply chains. My name is Jason Lutz, a Senior Technical Account Manager with Amazon Web Services.
And I'm Adam Lomas, Founder and Chief Trust Officer at Managed Risk Partners. Let's dive in. Today, we're going to take a look at this agenda.
So we're going to do a review of the Cloud Controls Matrix itself, version 4. We're also going to deep dive into the supply chain management, transparency, and accountability controls, STA. We'll look at the shared security responsibility model, and we'll also look at risks and best practices. And then we'll conclude with some thoughts.
Let's start by going all the way up to the Cloud Controls Matrix version 4, commonly referred to as the CCM, and make sure that we have a high-level understanding of what the CCM is.
So what is the Cloud Controls Matrix? Well, it's a framework developed by the CSA, leveraging expertise and research from cloud security professionals. It helps with implementation security in the cloud. It also helps with assessments. And you'll see there's some companion documentation that really help with both the implementation assessments. It also helps with compliance across any cloud environment, regardless of the provider. So it's agnostic. It's not for a specific cloud provider or SaaS service. Additionally, it maps global and industry security frameworks. And that's great for governance, risk, and compliance professionals, your GRC people. They want to know, especially in regulated industries, that you're following those industry frameworks as well, so you can map that CCM to it.
If you're not super familiar with doing business in the cloud, if you are trying to reason about what is it that is my responsibility when it comes to securing and operating the parts of the system that need to be secured, and what is the provider doing for me. The CCM also helps to clarify that, and we're going to get into that in a lot more detail in this supply chain transparency and accountability domain. The CCM covers all the cloud models, so whether you're building or purchasing or implementing software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, it doesn't matter. The CCM covers all of those models. And it also forms the backbone of the CSA STAR program, which is a program that lets organizations attest to their security objectives across the domains of the CCM.
Yeah. And so this is one of my favorite slides, the components, because it's much more than just this framework. There's a lot of pieces that contribute to it and support it. So, for example, one of the main documents that support it is called the Consensus Assessments Initiative Questionnaire. And I could never remember that, so I typically call that the CIQ. I've even heard it called the cake. But it basically provides yes or no questions that help support those control objectives in the CCM. So, for example, if you're going to assess a cloud service provider, or if you're going to engage in a SaaS and you want to run those questions by them, that's where you would pull the cake in. Adam?
And part of version 4, one of the updates I liked was the documents became a little bit easier to handle, because in the same spreadsheet that has the CCM, you've got the cake in another tab. You've also got the implementation guidelines. Those offer the breakdown of each individual control with more detail, not just on the specifications, but recommendations and things that you should consider if you need clarity on what's this control objective trying to tell me, because the control objective is pretty simple and terse. There's a lot of nuance that you might be looking for when you're trying to actually implement that in your environment. And so the implementation guidelines are an excellent resource when you're trying to get that additional detail. I also find the mappings incredibly helpful, because that's kind of what makes it so versatile and agnostic, because you've got this backbone of best practices in the Cloud Controls Matrix, but you can also map that across to requirements that you have in other security frameworks and other compliance frameworks. And so that lets you align the control objectives that you have in those frameworks with what you can do specifically in the cloud. And so that's a really, really helpful piece of the picture that the CCM helps pull together.
I'm definitely in agreement with that. I refer to the mappings all the time. So for the cloud controls matrix, the consensus assessment initiative questionnaire, the CAKE, the implementation guidelines, you can visit the Cloud Security Alliance website and download those materials. So the CCM itself, version 4, encompasses a wide range of security domains, ensuring comprehensive cloud security. So it includes 17 domains, as you can see here, and that includes 197 controls within those domains. The CAKE, or the CIQ, the questionnaire version 4, that one provides 261 questions of detailed assessment for a provider's implementation of each control objective.
Today, though, we're going to just focus on one specific domain, and that's the supply chain management, transparency, and accountability domain, or STA. You know, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and that's a principle that is true in cloud supply chains. So let's take a look at how the CCM can help to identify, understand, and mitigate different supply chain risks. The supply chain management, transparency, and accountability domain here has 14 controls, and those are divided up into two categories. There's controls that are performed collaboratively by both the customer and the provider. We'll get to some examples of those, but those are called the joint controls. And then we have independent controls, so things that can only be performed separately, but have to be carried out by both the customer and the provider based on their own unique roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, I could give an example of that. So a joint control, negotiating and agreeing on contract terms. Both sides of this, the provider and the customer, need to agree on that. An independent control would be like looking at your supply chain risk management policies and procedures. So it's going to be different for the provider, it's going to be different for the customer. So they're distinctive and they'd have to each do those controls themselves.
All right. So as we said, there's 14 controls in this domain. Um, let's take a run through each of them, Jason. Maybe we'll just talk about them at a super high level, and then we'll talk a little bit more about kind of how each party plays into the responsibilities here and how you can actually dig into the specifics that you'll want to be doing depending if you're a provider or a customer. So at the top here, we've got STA01, policies and procedures. All the domains of the CCM have this similar top level um, control, and that's the need around well-defined policies and procedures for the domain. In the STA domain, that means how you're going to apply the shared responsibility model, the shared security responsibility model through your, documented, approved, communicated, annually reviewed policies, right?
Exactly. Yeah, almost every domain in the CCM always starts with policies and procedures. Got to have those or else no
And
documentation.
everything flows from there, right? Like it sounds boring, but we start with what do we need to do? And then the rest of these controls ladder back up to, well, how are we actually operationalizing that?
Yeah, and looking on the matrix of these controls in the STA domain, if you look at STA 02 through 04, supply chain guidance, SSRM, control ownership, it's really talking about implementing and documenting the shared security responsibility model. It provides the customer with guidance, and it also talks about the control ownership.
5 and 6 here, we've got documentation review where you're going to be, validating that you've got a shared security responsibility model documented and that it makes sense for your organization and the relationship between the customer and the provider. The control implementation control, we're making sure that the controls are actually implemented and that they can be assessed. And then in number 7 here, making sure that you actually know the supply chain relationships that exist and that you've got that inventory in place.
Yeah, and STA 08 is one of my favorite. Reminds me of like vendor management and jumping in there, but evaluating the risk factors across all your supply chain entities. So that's that supply chain risk management, STA 08.
And that's not just making sure that, they've got a report, but it's actually like evaluating all the risk factors. And we'll get into those details here in a little bit.
Absolutely. Let's see, supply chain, STA, domain controls, STA 09, STA 10. So primary service and contractual agreement, supply chain agreement review. So you got to have those terms, the mutually agreed provisions, and you have to conduct annual reviews to ensure that everybody's aligned still.
That's right. And then 11 and 12 and 13, we've got compliance testing. So making sure that internally your controls are conformant and effective. Then looking through your service agreements, making sure that your supply chain partners are also meeting those security and privacy requirements. And in 13, we're looking at the governance level, making sure that your partners in the supply chain have the right policies and practices at governance level in place. And then finally, in 14, the supply chain data security assessment, making sure that you have defined and are conducting security assessments up and down that supply chain for all your supply chain organizations. So that's like a quick run through the high level of the controls. Jason?
Yeah. So we've alluded to, the shared security responsibility model and who's supposed to be doing what, and we've talked about these joint ones and independent ones. So we're going to jump in, 3, 2, 1, and jump into we're going to jump into that. I'm going to start that slide again. So now that we've covered those controls, and we've alluded to some of these controls are shared jointly and independent. We're going to talk about those a little bit more when it comes to the shared security responsibility model. And this is between the provider and the cloud service customer. And it can be both. So let's take a look at those.
Let's start with the responsibilities that usually are going to fall solely, exclusively on the cloud service provider. And we highlighted these here in blue. When it comes to like deciding who is actually responsible for which controls when it comes to a given cloud solution. Sometimes this is surprising for folks to realize, but that's not something that you need to be figuring out as the customer. That is entirely on the responsibility of the provider to be clear and transparent about who should be operating which parts of the shared security responsibility model based on how they have defined that for their cloud service. So it's not on the customer to be, guessing at that. That should be sort of clearly available information for you, so that you understand what the provider is responsible for versus what you're responsible for.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. So the cloud service provider, they're really controlling the environment. So they kind of need to give guidance to the customer, like, hey, this is how you secure yourself on our platform. And so it makes sense to me. So like some examples, looking at this, like a third party manages the physical data center. The CSP should make that clear that who's responsible for there. If the customer is responsible for backup, they should specify that and say, hey, you're responsible for the backup. We're not going to be responsible if you don't have that data, for example. Let's see. So CSPs, they should really document who does what to make sure there's no confusion. And by the way, that's really covered under STA 04, the control ownership. So again, the CIQ helps define really who those assigned owners are. So don't forget about the using the CIQ and the implementation guidelines as well.
Yeah, you can kind of go through that cake and you can say like, do we do this, yes or no? And if like we're not doing it, then who is? And use that to kind of make sure that it's clear, where for a given solution that that responsibility is actually being carried out. That's super important. Like the backup example that you gave, I like that one because sometimes you assume that because you're in the cloud, you've got a backup and recovery strategy, and that's handled by the cloud provider. But you have to really dig in and make sure that is that a service that you are paying for? Is that something that you need to configure? How does it actually work when you need it? So if you've got a critical system that you're relying on in the cloud, you want to make sure that you do understand whose responsibility is what. Another example where this comes up is single sign-on. A lot of times you think when you are implementing SSO, awesome. I don't have to rely on the cloud provider anymore for any of the identity management controls. That's all now on my identity management system. So, those controls are on me. I don't have to, worry about the shared responsibility model on the provider side for that. But I would ask, what about admin accounts that usually bypass SSO? If you are using a break glass procedure where there are local accounts on that cloud service that never use SSO or can bypass SSO, what is your responsibility to keep those accounts properly configured to be secured? So those are some examples of what you're going to, be, pretty critical at digging into between the CSP and the customer to get aligned on who's responsible for what and when, just to make sure that there's no gaps that are left unaddressed.
Yeah. Let's take a look at some of those shared dependent controls that we talked about. So these are where both parties work together to define, document, and manage the responsibilities. So like the controls STA02, STA05, STA06. These talk about the supply chain, they talk about document review, and they talk about implementation. So the responsibilities are outlined, they're documented, implemented, and managed. Uh, it ensures all the roles and responsibilities are reviewed, clarified, and formally agreed on. And each party must, they must monitor their own assigned controls as well. And this could be supported by independent assessments to just verify that they're being done.
And so, again, that's where you each got a role together in doing this, but also kind of independently because the customer has their controls that they're responsible for and they're doing their assessment of. The provider has their controls that they're responsible for and they're doing their assessment of. But the customer needs the provider's assessment. The CSP should be prepared to share that assessment with the customers that they have and the customers that want to join because they're kind of passing through those assessment results as part of the transparency in that supply chain. So exactly what is shared, how that sharing happens, that's a detail that you want to be really clear on in your contracts, and that's actually what comes up here in STA 9, where you're outlining those minimal contractual terms, the minimum terms that have to be agreed upon between the provider and the customer. It's not an exhaustive list. It's not everything that you should be looking at, but they're definitely the bare minimum that have to be included to make sure that the requirements within the cloud controls matrix are addressed. It's not enough just to talk about them or to write them down informally during the sales process. You got to have them in the contract in order to satisfy the control. If it's not in writing, it doesn't count.
And since it's in writing, legal advisors definitely need to be familiar with these cloud contracts. And if they need help with assessing, the wording within those legal contracts, they can definitely look at the CCM's implementation guidelines, and that'll give them a better understanding of what the controls are trying to achieve. Let's take a look. STA 10 here, supply chain agreement review. So obviously the reviews need to be done at least annually, but it's not just to have the annual checkbox, but it's also about checking to make sure that they're effective, that the controls are effective, that risk assessments and audits support that the controls are in place, and so on. So during that agreement review, here's the time to make changes and realign in those areas.
And there's a really important consideration there because if you're, the whole point that you're doing this is to make sure that you've got contracts that are effective, and you might have to make changes either to the contracts or to the provider underneath the contract if they're not able to deliver on it. You're going to want to make sure that you aren't leaving those contract reviews to the last minute. You're going to want to be intentional about aligning those with any notice periods that you have in those contracts. And of course, that's going to make sure that you've got time to renegotiate the terms or explore alternative providers before the critical deadlines like termination notice provisions.
Let's talk about those shared independent controls, Adam.
So one of these we already covered. The first one here around policies and procedures. Again, specifically in the STA domain, that's going to focus on how you are, implementing the shared security responsibility model and the policies around that. So, you want to define your objectives. Why are you doing that? What are the roles and responsibilities across the organization in making sure that it gets, implemented and upheld? What are the decision-making processes and the communication flows around that? How do you integrate those policies with the details in those service contracts? And when you go to the implementation guidelines in the CCM, or the next tab over, those have a lot of detail on how you want to structure those policies effectively. So definitely a place where those implementation guidelines can be really helpful. Um, if we look at STA 12 here, that's another policy requirement that is, in this case, it's focused on the supply chain service agreement compliance. So it's where we're focused on the policies that make sure that all of your partners in the supply chain, third, fourth, nth party suppliers, have adequate security measures and that they're contractually required into those. So, it's really how are you passing down the requirements that you have in your organization to your sub-suppliers, because those are also being passed down to you by your customers if you're a provider.
Yeah, and on this list, STA 7, supply chain inventory, and STA 08, supply chain risk management, are great examples of being independent but shared controls. So, for example, your supply chain inventory, an up to date inventory of supply chain relationships, that's not going to be something that both parties share. It's going to be individual. So, one party can't do that for the other, for example. Supply chain risk management, so evaluating risk factors and leveraging the data to inform contract reviews and adjustment, that's going to be independent for each one of those organizations involved, be it the provider or the customer. All right. And looking at STA 11, compliance testing. So, yeah, a shared independent control. So, compliance testing to make sure that the agreed controls are functioning as expected, that governance reviews are done to evaluate supply chain partners and make sure that they're within the expectations defined in the policies. Data security assessments verifying data protection measures are done throughout the supply chain and meet required standards. These assessments provide essential feedback in the SSRM controls to make sure they're effective and up to date.
And it is essential, right? Like this kind of helps give you the loop back because each of these controls give data that say, do we need to change our policies? Do we need to change our contracts? Do we need to, hold our suppliers to a different account based on, how the data from the system that we've built is telling us. So, there's a lot of nuance and important connection here in the supply chain transparency and accountability area that I think is a really exciting part of this domain. But not a lot of people are super excited about this level of detail, Jason. Huh?
I'm excited.
Well, the reason that I am excited about it is because at the end of the day, the reason we're doing this stuff is because there are some risks in the supply chain that are really important to manage for, right? And because of the web of organizations that we're relying on to be able to deliver, available, secure systems, we've got the cloud control matrix here that helps us to make sure that we know how together all of us are doing that work. And the risk that we're trying to manage for and the best practices that we apply here, let's take a look at a couple of those.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. So just highlighting some of these. So the first risk, the CSP, the provider, or the CSC, the customer, is not aware of their responsibilities resulting in failures to address security risks. Well, the guidance here, use the shared security responsibility model and the CCM to basically ensure that you're both in agreement with who's responsible for each control. And the second risk listed here, controls are not defined and implemented properly. So there's a gap there. Well, you want to ensure all necessary controls for the cloud service are covered. So you could use that CCM as a checklist. And the implementation guidelines detail exactly how the control objectives should be put in place. It gives you a lot of perspective on the objective of that control. Let's see.
Other risks here, in when we're looking at the supply chain, if we look back at a lot of the recent security incidents, an organization can be impacted by a breach that happens not in their organization directly, but in an organization that's in their supply chain. And part of the work that we're doing through implementing a shared security responsibility model and having good supply chain transparency and accountability is making sure that we are able to identify incidents and manage them properly throughout that supply chain, not just if they happen under our own nose, but that we're aware of them up and down the supply chain. And so the best practice, of course, is establishing clear coordination points between organizations for operations and for incident response, making sure that we can handle those quickly. And we when we look at the details in the CCM, we see how we get those documented and in the contracts, and that's one of the practices that really ties back against hopefully trying to speed up how we detect and respond to the risk of something happening and us not knowing about it and it being able to languish and have a bigger damage or impact than we want. Another issue comes up when the contractual agreement isn't clear enough, or there's transparency issues in the language, and so it's not clear exactly who's supposed to be doing what. Um, I think that's why the best practice here is using the shared security responsibility model, going beyond just the contractual agreement. Like we definitely use the contract, but we also have additional documentation, and we go through the work to make sure that we know who is doing what, and we can use that then as a basis for making sure that we've established that transparency and done the work to align on who's responsible for what, and that's properly reflected in the contractual agreement. And then ultimately, there's a risk that a big break in the supply chain can lead not just to a security incident, but an availability incident. We've seen massive availability outages because of, components in the supply chain. So, again, going through standardized due diligence practices, using the CSA Star Alliance program to be able to assess the level of readiness of a cloud provider, using the cake, directly if they're not on the CSA Star program, and to do your work to evaluate those supply chain risks holistically, and make sure that you're continuing to do that work on the regular basis that the CCM kind of lays out. Jason?
Yeah, I feel like this all comes down to improving the collaboration and the transparency between the provider and the customer.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it can be hard work. The more preparation that we each do on each side, and the more ready we are to have these conversations and use common tools like the CCM and the cake, hopefully that makes it a little bit easier and less confusing. And hopefully the work we've done, talking through this today, helps make that a little bit more approachable. Of course, as we're wrapping up here, we have to acknowledge that we didn't cover everything in detail, not every possible nuance. This supply chain management, transparency, and accountability domain is huge. So you can find all the details in the guidance that we discussed today, and more in the CCM, in the implementation guidelines, in the cake, and in the security guidance and other documentation that the Cloud Security Alliance provides.
I think a key takeaway, especially if you're new to the cloud or if your organization's adopting, let's say, a SaaS service, is the things that it supports. So one, it supports security assessments. You can check to see if you're properly applying security objectives throughout those domains that are listed in the cloud controls matrix. It'll help you develop policy and review the policy, with the annual reviews and the frequency and what the policy should cover. It'll help clarify contracts and provisions within between the customer and the provider, and it'll help achieve compliance across cloud environments. Often organizations are multi-cloud, and so by using an agnostic framework like the CCM, you can ensure that you're covering all the security objectives that's required by your organization.
That's right, Jason. And wrapping up here, I think it's also important that we recognize the many contributors to the CCM, the associated resources, the CSA working groups who help pull all of this together, the expertise and the dedication to make these tools happen. That's invaluable to the security community for sure.
Yeah, and if you're interested in assisting, the collaboration is great. You could join the CCM working group to help shape the CCM and to do some of that mapping. So contact the Cloud Security Alliance for any resources or assistance.
Thanks a lot for your time today. We definitely hope that you'll continue to explore the CCM and the resources that it provides, and you'll be able to use that to strengthen your security and transparency in your cloud supply chains.